The stones that moved without water. The morning of April 9th, 1834, was cold enough that Silas Keel's breath moved ahead of him in small white clouds as he waded into the Ohio River before sunrise. He carried his pole, a willow staff 7 feet long, notched every 3 inches by a jackknife blade, worn smooth from 100,000 uses. The water came up to his thighs and then his waist, cold enough that his muscles seized and his teeth pressed together without his permission. He moved out along the crossing line, one hand on the ferry cable, the other working the pole down toward the river floor. The first stone was wrong. He knew immediately. In 22 years of ferrying this crossing, Silas Keel had placed 12 river stones along its bottom, each one selected for weight and flatness. Each one dropped into a specific position he had memorized down to the foot. The stones served as depth benchmarks, a system he had developed himself after nearly losing a wagon and a team of 4 horses in a flash flood in 1813. When the river had surged overnight, and the crossing that had been 4 feet deep at dawn was 7 feet deep before the sun cleared the tree line. He needed to know what the river was doing. The stones told him. Each morning he walked the line, drove his pole to each stone, and read the water level off the notches. 7 notches meant caution. 9 notches meant close the crossing. 11 notches meant get the livestock off the bank and pray. Stone number 1 should have been sitting 14 feet from the Virginia bank in 2 feet and 8 inches of water under normal spring conditions. Silas drove his pole to the bottom, felt nothing, moved left, moved right, went upstream 6 inches, then 8. Found it, 11 inches from where it should have been, in water reading 3 notches deeper than yesterday. He stood in the cold river and looked at that pole for a long time. The current at that point ran at perhaps 2 knots, no more. The stone weighed close to 40 pounds. Moving it 11 inches against that current required a direct and intentional human hand. He continued along the line. Stone number 3 was displaced by 8 inches. Stone number 7 had moved nearly 2 feet downstream, settling in water 3 full inches deeper than yesterday's reading. Stone number 9, a broad gray limestone slab he had carried to that crossing in 1819 under the silent assumption that it would never need moving again, was gone entirely from its position. He found it 14 feet from where it belonged, resting against a submerged root mass in a location no current in any season would have chosen. By the time he reached the Ohio bank, 9 of his 12 stones had been displaced. 4 of them had moved into deeper water. None had moved upstream. None had moved in any direction consistent with the way the current actually ran at that crossing point and at that hour of the morning. Silas Keel climbed out of the water, settled onto the bank, and sat without speaking for 3 full minutes. Then he opened his log and wrote, April 9th. 9 stones moved. Not by river. He'd been running this crossing since 1812. The site was known locally as Keel's Ford, not because of any official designation, but because of 22 years of continuous operation and the kind of reputation that attaches to a man who has never lost a passenger to the current. The Ohio here ran approximately 280 yards from bank to bank in normal water stages. In high spring, it could swell to 340 yards. In drought, it narrowed to 210. Silas knew every number. He had recorded water levels on the first day of every open month since the winter of 1815. filling 4 ledger books with depth readings, weather notations, and passenger counts that no one had ever thought to ask about. He was 53 years old in 1834. Born in Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, the son of a millwright and the grandson of a man who had helped survey the Forbes Road through western Pennsylvania in 1758. That surveying instinct had come through the family the way strong hands come down, not as a taught skill, but as a species of discomfort with imprecision, a restlessness that could only be quieted by measurement. Silas could not look at a river without wanting to know where it ran deepest and where the bed was shifting. He was not an educated man. He had attended school for a total of 11 weeks across his entire life. But his father had once told him something he had carried for 40 years. A man who keeps a careful number is worth more in a dispute than a man who keeps a careful argument. He had believed that. He had built his professional life on that single principle. The crossing connected Gallipolis Township on the Ohio side with a stretch of Virginia bottomland that had been, in 1812, mostly forest and 3 scattered homesteads. By 1834, that had changed considerably. The Virginia side had grown. New farms stood along the river flat, and a loose cluster of buildings, calling itself Carlton's Landing, had taken shape half a mile upstream. A dry goods store, a tavern, a mill under construction, and most significantly, a land agent's office that had opened in the spring of 1832 under the management of a man named Harlow Vick. Silas had no particular opinion of Vick at the time. The man was smooth in his speech, well dressed in the manner of someone who had studied the performance of prosperity rather than simply acquired it. And he arrived at the ferry landing twice a week with a leather satchel and a distant expression. He crossed to the Ohio side on Tuesdays and Fridays, spent 2 to 3 hours there, and returned. He tipped a dime. Consistent, but not generous. He asked no questions and answered few. Silas had ferried 100 men of that particular variety across this river. The Ohio in the 1830s moved men whose business was the movement of money from one jurisdiction to another, and a ferryman learned early to treat that knowledge as ballast, useful for stability, not for conversation. What Silas did know was this. In the 3 years since Vick had opened his operation at Carlton's Landing, a series of land disputes had begun working their way through county and state courts on both sides of the river. The source of the trouble was the river itself. Under the Compact of 1818, the legal instrument that fixed the Ohio-Virginia boundary, the border ran along the low water mark on the Virginia shore as defined by the thread of the main navigable channel. In plain terms, wherever the deepest navigable part of the river ran, that was where the state line fell, and where the line fell determined which state's courts heard your claim, which state's tax collectors knocked on your door, and for the 31 farming families who had homesteaded the Ohio side bottomland between 1819 and 1829, whether the title to your land held at all. Ohio property law in the 1830s favored the small landholder. Virginia land law, particularly as it applied to pre-existing colonial-era land warrants, favored the large estate holder. Warrants issued by the Virginia colonial government in the 1760s and 1770s covered millions of acres across the western territories, many of them never fully surveyed, many of them sitting dormant in the files of Virginia land companies, accruing no value until the political geography shifted in a way that made them suddenly enforceable. If the navigable channel of the Ohio River at Keel's Ford was determined to run in a position closer to the Virginia bank than where it had historically been, if certified survey maps showed the deep water shifted southward, then the legal border followed. Those 31 Ohio homesteads fell inside Virginia jurisdiction. Pre-existing Virginia colonial warrants could be argued to supersede the later Ohio grants, and the men who held those warrants would own what the farmers had spent a decade building. It was a mechanism so obscure that most of the families on those 31 homesteads had never heard of it. Silas Keel had. He had heard it discussed at the ferry landing in the fall of 1833, when two men from a Virginia law firm crossed to the Ohio side and spent 4 hours walking the bottomland before returning with careful expressions and saying nothing. 3 mornings after the first anomalous reading, Silas arrived before first light and waited the line again. He was deliberate in everything. He had spent the previous evening resetting all 12 stones to their calibrated positions, crawling along the cable in chest-deep water, driving his pole to each benchmark, physically relocating the displaced stones by hand in the dark. It had taken 4 hours. It had cost him 2 days of stiffness in his lower back, which he was old enough to know would not improve on its own. The stones had moved again, not randomly, in a coherent directional pattern. All of them shifted toward the Ohio bank. The heaviest displacements concentrated between stone 7 and stone 10, in the zone where the current ran fastest and where no man without the cable overhead could stand. The displacement was not accidental. The pattern was not current. Something was operating on those stones with intention. He reset them a second time. He told no one. He did not yet know what he was looking at, but he knew that describing it to anyone before he understood it would sound like a ferryman who'd been staring at too much water for too many years. On the morning of April 17th, 8 days after his first anomalous reading, Silas attempted a second measurement approach. He borrowed a canoe from his neighbor Calhoun and paddled to a point 40 yards upstream of the crossing line, then let the canoe drift across while he ran depth soundings at 10-foot intervals using a weighted line, a lead sinker tied to 20 feet of rope, knotted every 6 inches. He had done this kind of survey before, after flood events, to check whether the crossing had been scoured. The readings he got did not match his stone position logs. Between stone positions 6 and 10, the depth was consistent with the displaced positions, not the correct ones. The river floor itself had changed configuration. He ran the canoe survey a second time that afternoon in the opposite direction. Same numbers. He ran it a third time the following morning. Same result. Between a point 60 feet from the Virginia bank and a point 90 feet short of the Ohio bank, the river floor read between 18 and 22 inches deeper than his October 1833 records. Not a flood scour. A flood scour was irregular, uneven, the work of moving water, choosing the weakest path. This was geometrically consistent. The depth change was deliberate, and it ran on a line. He returned to his cabin and sat with his logs until the candle burned short. He had 19 years of measurements and 3 weeks of anomalies, forming a picture he did not want to name directly. He looked at it sideways, the way a man looks at a thing he suspects will change his life. Then he wrote in his log, April 18th, 3rd canoe survey confirms. Bottom geometry altered. Dimensions consistent with placed structure, not natural. He went into the water on the morning of April 22nd, 1834, and he did not come back up for 4 hours. He had tied 100 feet of rope to the ferry cable at the midpoint of the crossing and worked his way along the river floor in a search pattern. 6 feet upstream, 6 feet back, probing with a sharpened iron rod he had hammered from a worn-out plowshare. The water temperature was 48 degrees. Below the surface, where the current pressed him sideways and the light dissolved from green to brown to nothing, he worked entirely by touch. His boots dragged along bottom gravel. His hands moved across silt and submerged branchwood and the occasional smooth face of a river stone. At a point 71 feet out from the Virginia bank, his iron rod struck something that did not move. Not rock. Rock rings back differently. A clean and brief resistance. This gave him a dull knock and held firm, and when he probed along it, it continued for 11 feet in a straight line, angled at roughly 30 degrees to the current direction. He probed below it. River gravel, undisturbed. He probed above it and felt vertical stakes, wooden, driven into the bed at intervals of approximately 18 inches. He surfaced, breathed, went back under. A second structure ran parallel to the first, 7 feet upstream, the same angle. Between the two structures, the riverbed had been raised with flat stones laid in a fitted pattern, edge to edge, deliberate, the work of someone who had studied how water moves and how to redirect it. Someone had built a weir, a submerged channel diversion structure, hidden below the navigable surface of the Ohio River at the main point of his crossing. Silas climbed out on the Virginia side, the nearer bank at that position, and sat in the mud while the water ran out of his boots. A surface weir was common work. Mill operators had been using surface weirs for 200 years. But a weir designed to redirect the deepest thread of a river channel while remaining invisible at every water stage required planning, engineering, and skilled underwater labor that no local operation could mount quietly. This had been financed. This had been designed. And it had been constructed in secret under the surface of a working river crossing, in darkness, while a ferryman carried passengers across the water above. He counted backward. His stone displacements had first appeared on April 9th, but the April 9th depth readings showed the change was already present. The bottom had already been altered before he first noticed the stones moving. That put construction before April 9th. He checked his October 1833 logs. Normal readings for that month, consistent with everything back to 1815. No records existed for November, December, January, February, or March. Those were the months when ice and high water closed the crossing entirely, and no ferryman walked the bottom. 4 winter months. The river sealed by ice above, empty of regular traffic, navigated only by men with specific purpose. In that window, while Keel's Ford sat frozen and unmonitored, someone had built a structure under the water precisely calculated to shift the navigable channel of the Ohio River 60 to 80 yards southward toward Virginia, taking the legal state boundary line with it. Under the Compact of 1818, that shift was valid. 31 families didn't know yet that they no longer lived in Ohio. He was not, by nature, a man who acted quickly on incomplete information. He went home and slept. He opened the crossing at its normal hour the next morning and moved passengers for the full day without raising the subject of what lay on the river floor below them. He did this for 7 consecutive days while he thought. What he possessed was a depth log covering 19 years. Not a professional survey, not a legal instrument. 12 river stones and a notched willow staff, maintained by a man who had no credential past a childhood in Pennsylvania and a lifetime on this water. He had no attorney, no official standing, no one in any office in Columbus who knew his name. He was a ferryman. His documentation would not survive a challenge from a Virginia land attorney in a federal court, and he understood that clearly. He needed a second measurement system, something verifiable by credentials he didn't have. He attempted first to contact the Army Corps of Engineers Survey Office in Marietta, 60 miles upriver. He wrote a letter on April 28th, careful with his spelling, and sent it with a trusted passenger. No response came in 14 days. He wrote a second letter, addressed to the Ohio Surveyor General's office in Columbus, 120 miles to the north. It left by riverboat post on May 3rd, 1834. A reply arrived 3 weeks later. A form letter acknowledging receipt, noting that field inspections were scheduled at the earliest in autumn, subject to funding. Autumn was 5 months away. His third attempt was not a letter. On May 17th, a circuit court judge named Partlow stopped at the crossing while traveling between Gallipolis and Pomeroy. Silas laid out his findings in the time it took to cross 280 yards of river. The stone displacements, the depth survey, the underwater structure, the winter construction window, the legal compact of 1818. He spoke without embellishment. The way a man speaks when he knows the time he has is exactly as long as the water is wide. Judge Partlow listened, which was more than Silas had expected. Then Partlow said, "You'll need a licensed surveyor's certification, a formal river survey, and you'll need to prove the structure was placed deliberately by identified parties with intent to defraud. A ferryman's depth log, however carefully kept, is not evidence a court will accept to redraw a state boundary line. I am sorry, Mr. Keel." Silas thanked him and pulled him to the Virginia bank. He went home that evening and took out his notched willow staff and held it in the lamplight. 19 years of measurement, every notch cut by the same hand, a record that had never missed an open water month since 1815. He could not make the courts accept it alone, but he could make it impossible to ignore if he could find the right hand to place it in front of. On the 1st of June, Harlowvick's Tuesday and Friday schedule changed. He began crossing on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays instead. More significantly, he was now accompanied by a second man, broad through the shoulders, quiet in his manner, wearing a battered felt hat, and carrying nothing in his hands. This man never crossed to the Ohio side. He remained on the Virginia bank. He was present at the start of each crossing day and there again at dusk. He stood in different positions each observation, upstream of the dock, then downstream, then at the tree line above the bank, which meant he was not waiting for a scheduled event. He was watching for something ongoing and unpredictable. On June 7th, Silas arrived before dawn and found that someone had been through his ferry shed during the night. Nothing was taken. The lock had been forced and reset imperfectly, the hasp sitting 2 degrees off level, barely visible in a direct examination. His depth log, stored in a tin box nailed to the shed's rear wall, had not been opened. Either they had not found it, or they had found it and not recognized it for what it was. The second possibility was the more unsettling. A man who didn't understand what he was looking at was likely to come back when he did. Silas moved the log to his cabin that same evening, concealed inside a flour sack, pressed between floor joists, beneath a loose board. Then he sat down and made copies. He had no one to give them to yet, but 22 years of ferrying men with secrets had taught him the fundamental law of documentary evidence. Original documents disappear when they become inconvenient. He wrote 2 full copies of his measurement records, April 9th through June 7th, 1834, by lamplight over 2 nights. He wrapped one in oilskin and gave it to Calhoun with 4 words: "Hold it. Ask nothing." The other he kept beneath the floorboards. On the morning of June 12th, Silas Keel resumed his daily sounding routine. The crossing was quiet. A light mist moved along the surface, the way Ohio River mist moves in early summer, thick at water level, thinning fast as it climbed, so that a man in a canoe appeared to be wading in fog up to his chest. He worked the cable methodically, pole down at each stone position, reading the morning levels. At stone position 8, the pole hit something that was not stone. He felt it clearly, not rock, not branch wood, not the clay and sand consistency of a silted bottom after current change. It was soft at first contact and then firm, with a resistance unlike any natural riverbed material he had encountered in 22 years. He probed left and right along it. It had dimension. It had shape. He drove the pole harder. It did not move. He surfaced and looked toward the Virginia bank. The man in the battered hat was there, standing 45 yards upstream, facing the water. Silas stood on the cable, chest deep, and he thought about the 4 months this river had been closed. He thought about what his pole had found and the specific quality of its resistance. He thought about the 31 families on the Ohio bottomland who did not yet know their jurisdiction had been sold from under them. He thought about the letter he had sent to Columbus that had returned a form document about autumn scheduling. He thought about the oilskin packet in Calhoun's possession and the copy under his floorboards and the 19-year record that no licensed surveyor had agreed to read. Then he thought about 120 miles of road to Columbus and the fact that he had not left this crossing in 11 years. He did not go back into the water that morning. He ran his crossings. 4 passengers, 2 mule teams, a wagon load of sacked grain that required 2 trips. He spoke normally to everyone. He collected his tolls at the standard rate. He wrote his passenger log in his usual hand, the same hand he had used for 43 years, and nothing in it would have told any observer that the man holding the pen had just found something at the bottom of an interstate river that he was not prepared to name in writing. At dusk, when the Virginia bank was empty and the battered hat man gone, Silas tied his ferry to the Ohio side and walked up to his cabin. He took out the oilskin copy of his depth log and looked at it by candlelight. Then he took out his willow staff, 7 feet, notched every 3 inches, 37 years old, and set it against the wall where he could see it. In the morning, he decided he was going to need to go to Columbus. 120 miles on foot through farmland and crossings that were not his. He had not left this river in 11 years. He had no money for a horse. He had never spoken to a legislator. He blew out the candle. He listened to the Ohio move in the dark outside. And at the bottom of the river, 8 feet below the surface, at stone position 8, whatever his pole had found was still there. He went back into the water before dawn on June 13th, 1834. He had not slept. He had lain on his pallet in the dark and listened to the Ohio move outside and thought about what a ferryman's sounding pole finds at 8 feet of depth in 50-degree water when it strikes something soft and then firm. He had cataloged the possibilities in the methodical way his mind worked through any measurement problem. Current debris, a drowned cattle beast, a snagged bale of trade goods, a waterlogged timber from the upriver mill construction. He had worked through each possibility and set it aside. By the third hour of darkness, he was left with the one possibility that did not set aside easily. And at 4 a.m, he got up, dressed, and walked down to the river with his pole. The mist was heavier than the previous day. It sat on the water in a continuous white layer roughly 3 feet deep, so that the surface of the Ohio was invisible until he was standing at the bank, and the mist edge was level with his knees. He tied on to the cable at the midpoint and worked out along it to stone position 8. He drove his pole down. The resistance was still there. Same location, same quality, same soft then firm characteristic that no natural riverbed material produced under a straight vertical probe. He worked the pole around it. The shape extended approximately 4 feet in one axis and perhaps 18 inches in the other. It was held against the bottom by the current, pressing it into a natural depression behind a submerged boulder that Silas had known about since 1820. The boulder had always created a small counter-current eddy on its downstream face. Someone with knowledge of this crossing had used that eddy deliberately, left something there knowing the current would hold it down. He surfaced, breathed, went back under. He reached down along the pole and found what it was resting against with his bare hand. He surfaced again and stayed in the water for a moment without moving. A man, dead, cold through in the particular way of deep water drowning, which is a thorough and absolute cold that goes past the temperature of the river itself, past any external weather, into something that has no comparison in the living world. Silas had pulled 4 drowned men from the Ohio in 22 years. He knew the quality of it. He got the body to the Ohio bank alone, working the cable, using his belt and the mooring rope from the ferry. It took 40 minutes. The man weighed approximately 160 pounds in life, and considerably more now. He was middle-aged, perhaps 45, with the rough hands of an outdoor working man and the clothing of someone who aspired to be taken for a gentleman. A decent wool coat, though the buttons were the practical flat kind, not decorative. In the coat's inside breast pocket, wrapped in oilskin that had not entirely done its job, was a small leather notebook with a brass clasp. Silas laid the notebook on the bank and opened it. The water damage was partial. The outer pages were illegible. The interior pages, 17 of them, were written in the cramped, precise hand of a man who had been trained to record numbers under field conditions. Measurements in feet and fractions of feet, bearing angles in degrees and minutes, dates running from September 14th, 1833 through February 3rd, 1834. At the top of the first legible page, in a cleaner hand that suggested he had copied it from a heading document, were 6 words: Kanawha River Associates, Channel Relocation Survey. The last entry in the notebook, dated February 3rd, 1834, was a single sentence written larger than anything else in the book, as though the man's hand had been pressing harder than usual. It read, "I will not certify this." H. Silas Keel held that notebook in the early morning light of June 13th, 1834, and read the full 17 pages 3 times, working slowly because the water had blurred certain figures and because what the numbers described required careful comprehension to believe. Then he wrapped it back in the oilskin, placed it inside his shirt, and went to bury the man whose name he had gathered from one other page was Archibald Holt. He dug the grave 20 feet from the water line on the Ohio bank above the flood stage. It took him 2 hours. He marked it with a flat stone and carved into the stone's face with his jackknife, A. Holt, found June 13th, 1834. S.K. It was the only monument Holt would receive for the next 47 years. Archibald Holt had been a civil engineer. The notebook made that clear without saying it explicitly. The precision of his measurements, the terminology he used for soil bearing, current velocity and hydraulic gradient, the shorthand references to structural concepts that a self-taught ferryman could follow only partially. What Silas could follow, he followed completely. The Kanawha River Associates, Inc. was a Virginia land company, organized informally between 1831 and 1832, composed of at least 4 named partners whose initials appeared in Holt's accounting entries, V, M, T, and B. Vic's initial appeared 17 times. The company held a portfolio of pre-revolutionary Virginia land warrants covering approximately 2,200 acres of Ohio River bottomland in 3 counties, including the stretch directly east of Keel's Ford on the Ohio side. Those warrants were legally dormant under Ohio jurisdiction. Under Virginia colonial law, with Virginia jurisdictional authority over the land, they could be activated. Holt had been contracted in August 1833 to design and oversee construction of a submerged channel diversion structure, a weir system, capable of shifting the main navigable thread of the Ohio River at Keel's Ford northward by between 70 and 80 yards without being detectable from the surface at any normal water stage. The design Holt produced, which he had sketched on 3 pages of the notebook in a detail that was half obliterated by water damage, relied on 2 parallel rows of driven timber stakes set at an angle of 28 degrees to the current flow, backfilled with flat-laid limestone slabs on the upstream face and river gravel on the downstream face. The structure did not block the river. It would have created obvious interference with navigation. Instead, it created an asymmetric resistance that progressively redirected the path of least resistance. The Thalweg, the deepest thread of the channel, toward the Ohio bank. The effect accumulated over time. By February 1834, after approximately 4 months of winter construction, the channel had migrated northward by an estimated 73 yards. Construction had been conducted in 3 phases between November 1st and March 15th, 1834, using hired river laborers brought in from the Kanawha Valley in western Virginia, men who did not know the politics of the Ohio boundary, who were paid in cash and dispersed before the ice broke. Holt had supervised the first 2 phases. By the 3rd phase, the final stone fill and grade, something had changed. His notebook entries became shorter, more guarded. On January 28th, he wrote, "Asked V directly what the certified survey will show. V says Briggs has already agreed to the numbers. On February 1st, Briggs will file in March. The filing will show the channel as it stands now, not as it was. And on February 3rd, the last entry, I will not certify this. H. Between February 3rd, 1834 and June 13th, 1834, a period of 130 days, Archibald Holt had gone from refusing to certify a fraudulent survey to being found dead on the floor of the Ohio River at the crossing his own engineering had falsified. Silas sat with the notebook for a long time. Then he put it away and did not look at it again until Columbus. His first instinct was the county sheriff. The Gallia County Sheriff's Office was in Gallipolis, 11 miles north along the Ohio bank. Silas had ferried Sheriff Anselm Crispin across the river 40 or 50 times since 1818. Crispin was a capable man, deliberate in his judgments, cautious in his politics, and completely unwilling to involve himself in anything that could be framed as an interstate commercial dispute. Silas knew this because in 1831, when a Kentucky livestock merchant had accused an Ohio farmer of cattle theft at the Gallipolis Landing, Crispin had watched the situation carefully for 3 weeks and then declined to file charges on the grounds that the relevant transaction might have occurred on the Virginia side and therefore fell outside his clear jurisdiction. He had used the word jurisdiction 4 times in a single sentence. A dead surveyor found in the Ohio River, connected to a Virginia Land Company's channel fraud, with a paper trail running into Army survey filings and interstate compact law, was precisely the kind of case Crispin would find 11 reasons to send to someone else. Silas did not go to the sheriff. His second instinct was the local magistrate, a man named Alderman Price, who operated out of a 2-room office in a farm settlement called Crown Ridge, 6 miles inland from the crossing. Price was an honest man as far as Silas knew. He was also the brother-in-law of a land broker named Timothy Marsh, whose courthouse filings Silas had observed at a distance through a window on his one visit to the county seat in 1829, being delivered by a rider who wore the same kind of flat-button coat as Archibald Holt. Marsh's initials were M in Holt's accounting entries. Silas did not go to the magistrate either. He stood in his cabin on the evening of June 13th and understood with the quiet certainty that comes from 22 years of reading water that there was no local institution he could approach that had not already been touched at one edge or another by the thing he was carrying. The fraud had been built to occupy that space, to sit in the gap between state jurisdictions, using federal survey authority to certify a condition that local officials could claim was above their review, and federal officials could claim was a local matter. Holt had seen it. I will not certify this. And Holt was dead in the Ohio River, held down by a current eddy at stone position 8, 11 feet from where nobody would have thought to look. Columbus was 120 miles. On the morning of June 14th, Silas Keel packed 3 things into a canvas sack: his oilskin-wrapped depth log, Archibald Holt's surveyor notebook, and his willow staff, which presented a problem. 7 feet of willow pole was not a walking staff, and not a concealed document, and not anything a traveling man could carry without drawing attention to it as a specific and purposeful object. He stood in his cabin and looked at it for a moment. Then he took his jackknife and cut it at the 4-foot mark. He re-notched the bottom end, starting from the new cut, spacing the notches every 3 inches exactly as they had been on the original. He was 4 feet and 1 inch tall from foot to measurement head now, instead of 7. He had lost the top 36 inches, the notches he had never needed, since the crossing had never run deeper than 72 inches at the sounding positions he used. He had kept everything that mattered. The cut-down staff fit inside the canvas sack alongside the log books, wrapped in burlap, invisible to anyone who didn't know to look. He locked the ferry shed. He rolled 4 pennies in a strip of cloth for road expenses. He nailed a note to the shed door. Crossing closed. Family illness. Back in 10 days. He had no family. But 10 days was a number he believed he could work inside. Before he left the crossing, he visited 2 of the Ohio side farming families whose names appeared in the Kanawha River Associates accounting entries as target parcels. The Reinhardt family, Emmett and Clara Reinhardt, 14 years on their claim, with 3 children and a 4th on the way, were in their yard when Silas arrived. They had received papers 3 weeks earlier. Legal papers from a Virginia court dated May 31st, 1834, informing them that their land claim was under review as potentially falling within Virginia jurisdiction under the Compact of 1818. The papers cited a certified survey by United States Army Lieutenant Josiah Briggs, completed February 14th, 1834, placing the main navigable channel of the Ohio River at Keel's Ford approximately 78 yards north of its historically mapped position. Emmett Reinhardt was a man of 39 who had built his farm from bare river bottomland with his own hands, and a loan he had not yet finished repaying. He held the Virginia court papers in both hands and said, "A man came last week, said if we wanted to avoid legal fees, there was a company willing to buy us out at fair value, 20 cents an acre." He looked at Silas. "I paid $1.60 an acre in 1820. The Puckett family, half a mile south, had received the same papers on the same date. They had not been visited by anyone offering to buy. They were, Silas gathered, considered less cooperative prospects. He left both families without telling them what he had found in the river. He did not want them to carry that knowledge in a county where 2 named partners in the company that had killed a man were within riding distance. He started walking north at 7:30 in the morning. He did not intend to stop at Gallipolis, but the county seat sat astride the only road north that did not add 9 miles of detour, and he had a calculation in his head that he could not set aside. The Gallia County Recorder's Office held public land and survey filings. If Briggs's survey had been filed in the county record, as it would have needed to be to function as the legal basis for the Virginia court papers, then Silas could see the actual filed document. He could compare its numbers directly to his own log, not as a legal argument, as a confirmation of the specific character of the fraud. He reached Gallipolis at noon. He went directly to the recorder's office, a small room attached to the rear of the county court building, staffed by a young clerk with ink on his left hand and a disposition toward procedural courtesy that Silas found temporarily reassuring. He asked to see any surveys of the Ohio River Channel adjacent to Keel's Ford, filed in the period between January and April of the current year. The clerk produced the Briggs survey after 8 minutes of searching. It was a formally printed document, 22 pages, bearing the seal of the United States Army Corps of Engineers and the certification signature of Lieutenant Josiah A. Briggs, dated February 14th, 1834, filed with Gallia County on March 3rd, 1834. The clerk told Silas he had 20 minutes with it. 17 of those 20 minutes were enough. The Briggs survey reported the main navigable channel of the Ohio at Keel's Ford, running at an average depth of 11 feet at the midpoint crossing line, with the channel thread located 78 yards north of the Virginia Bank's low water mark. Silas's October 1833 depth log showed the midpoint sounding at 8 feet 4 inches. His stone positions from that same October placed the channel thread at approximately 31 yards, closer to the Virginia Bank than the Briggs figures indicated. The two documents described the same river at the same crossing point, with measurements that could not both be true unless the river itself had fundamentally changed between October of 1833 and February of 1834. The river had not changed. The weir had moved it. Briggs had surveyed the moved river and certified the moved position as the natural one. The fraud was not a plan or a proposal. It was a filed, certified, legally accepted document in the custody of Gallia County, Ohio, sitting in a clerk's cabinet 11 feet from where Silas Keel was standing. He handed the survey back to the clerk with 2 minutes remaining. He thanked him. He walked to the door. A man stepped out of a recessed doorway on the left side of the corridor and fell into step beside him. He was medium height, wearing a deputy's badge on a coat that was too warm for June. He said his name was Foss and that he worked for Sheriff Crispin. He kept his voice low and level, the way a man speaks when he wants to sound helpful while delivering something that is not help. He said, "Mr. Keel, I'd strongly advise you take the river road back to Gallipolis and go home. River channel surveys are federal matters. A county recorder's file isn't the place to be starting arguments about Army certifications." He paused at the building's outer door and added, "The sheriff has an interest in keeping this county's commerce undisturbed." Silas said nothing. He walked out of the county building and turned north on the Columbus Road. He made 22 miles the first day and sheltered in a hay barn belonging to a German farming family named Hochstedler, who asked no questions and charged 30 cents for the space, which was reasonable. He made 19 miles on the second day, June 15th, stopping at a crossroads settlement to eat cold cornbread and water from a public trough, and to speak briefly with a Methodist circuit rider named Deacon Ezra Morse, who was traveling south toward Gallipolis, and who agreed, after a careful 5-minute conversation, to carry a folded letter ahead to a printer at the Columbus Gazette named Olmsted. The letter said only, "Arriving within 4 days. Have documents. Ohio River Channel fraud. Federal involvement. 1 man dead. Do not send word back. Answer at your door. S. Keel, Keel's Ford." Morse tucked the letter inside his coat and rode south. Silas continued north. On the morning of June 17th, the third day, he was 54 miles from Columbus, moving through Pickaway County farmland, south of Chillicothe. The road was dry and straight, and the weather was clear. He felt the canvas sack against his back, where the oilskin log and Holt's notebook rode together, and he walked at a measured pace that he calculated would take him into Columbus before the end of June 20th, assuming no further delays of a structural kind. At 5 in the afternoon, he reached a farmstead operated by a widow named Haynes, who let traveling men sleep in her woodshed for a nickel and did not ask where they were going, which he had identified as the most important criterion for that particular night. He paid, ate cold salt pork and dry bread from the widow's kitchen window transaction and settled into the woodshed with his sack under his head and the canvas-wrapped staff along his right side. He had been asleep for perhaps 2 hours when the widow's boy, a child of 9 or 10, barefoot, moving the way frightened children move when they're trying to appear calm, came into the woodshed doorway and said in a voice kept carefully low, "Mister, 3 men on horses stopped at the crossroads back a half-mile, asking after a man traveling alone toward Columbus, carrying a walking stick." Silas opened his eyes. He did not sit up immediately. He lay still for 4 seconds and looked at the woodshed ceiling in the dark. He reached into the canvas sack and found the cut-down willow staff by touch. 4 feet of re-notched willow wrapped in burlap. Everything that mattered carried in a bag that looked like a working man's tools. He had cut it precisely so it would not look like what it was. He sat up. He pressed a coin into the boy's hand without looking at which denomination. He picked up the sack. He went to the woodshed's rear wall, which had a gap in the boards, 2 feet wide where a plank had split and been removed and not replaced, and he went through it into the dark field behind the farmhouse. The night was moonless, 54 miles from Columbus. The Columbus road was behind him, and 3 men on horseback were on it. He oriented north by the stars, his grandfather's Forbes road skill come down through 60 years, and began moving through the field in the dark, parallel to the road, but 60 yards off it, in the direction of Columbus. He could hear behind him the sound of horses at the crossroads, not moving yet, talking. In his sack, a 19-year depth log, a dead engineer's notebook, and a 4-foot willow staff, with every measurement that mattered still intact. The men behind him didn't know about the copy in Calhoun's oilskin. They didn't know about the second copy under the floorboard at the crossing. They knew about a ferryman with a walking stick. They did not know that the walking stick was the evidence. 54 miles. He moved into the dark. He moved through 4 miles of Ohio farmland in complete darkness without stopping. He navigated by stars and by the sound of the road. He could hear it to his right when the wind was right, the occasional creak of a night wagon or the distant clip of a shod horse on packed dirt. And he kept 60 yards of open ground between himself and it at all times. His boots were wet to the ankle from a drainage ditch he had crossed without seeing. His canvas sack rode against his back with the particular weight of things that matter more than comfort. He did not think about the men on horseback. He thought about the direction of north and the distance of 54 miles, and the amount of darkness remaining before the road became visible enough to be a liability. He walked until he found a property boundary he could not see but could feel. A split-rail fence running east to west, which meant a farm clearing, which meant that somewhere ahead was a structure. He followed the fence east for 200 yards and found a corn crib set 30 feet from a larger barn. Both were unlocked in the manner of structures built in a community where locking had not yet become the primary language of trust. He went into the corn crib, made himself a space between the wall and a stack of winter-kept seed corn, and slept for 4 hours. He was walking again before the sun touched the tree line. He reached the edge of Chillicothe at mid-morning on June 18th, moving through the town's south quarter on a cart track that skirted the main street entirely. He needed 2 things: a meal and a piece of information. The meal he bought from a woman selling corn mush from a pot at a churchyard gate for 2 cents a bowl. The information required a longer conversation. there was a man in Chillicothe named Caleb Shrum. Silas knew of him the way ferrymen knew of people along the river roads, by a kind of professional geographic memory that recorded anyone who affected the movement of goods or persons along a sustained corridor. Shrum operated a licensed wagon freight business, ran 12 horses, and hauled cargo between Chillicothe and Columbus 3 times a week on a schedule that had been unchanged for 6 years. More relevantly, Shrum was the brother of a man named Felix Shrum, who had homesteaded 60 acres of Ohio bottomland 2 miles north of Keel's Ford in 1821, and whose name appeared on the Virginia court papers served 2 weeks earlier. Silas found Caleb Shrum at his freight yard by asking once and being pointed toward a large man with a gray beard sitting on a wagon tongue eating bread from his coat pocket. He sat down beside him without preamble and told him about the weir in 40 words. Then he told him about Holt in 20 words. Then he put the oilskin log in Shrum's hands and said, "Your brother's name is in a Virginia court filing. This document says the river they used to take his land was not the river that was there." Shrum looked at the log for a long time. Then he said quietly, "I've got a Columbus run at noon. You ride in the back under the canvas." They left at 12 minutes past noon. Silas Keel lay in the back of the freight wagon under 4 feet of canvas sheeting and the smell of old rope and river trade goods, and listened to the Ohio farmland pass beneath the wheels for 7 hours. When the wagon made its first Columbus Street crossing, he sat up. He had not been to Columbus in 11 years. The city had grown in ways that surprised him. 3-story brick buildings on the main street, a permanent market structure, a gas light standard at the State House corner that he stared at for a moment before his mind cataloged it and moved on. The State House dome was visible above the roof line to the north. He looked at it without expression and then looked away. He found the Columbus Gazette's printing office on Friend Street at 7:45 in the evening. The door was locked. A light showed through the rear window. He knocked. The man who answered was named Olmsted, first name Josiah, though his professional card said J. Olmsted only, a distinction that Silas did not remark upon. He was perhaps 40 years old, slight, with the self-contained intelligence of a man who had been reading too much for too long and had developed a corresponding impatience with people who hadn't. He looked at Silas for 2 seconds and said, "You're the ferryman. I got the letter 3 days ago. I've been waiting." He opened the door and stood aside. They worked by lamp at the Gazette's printing table for 4.5 hours. Olmsted was not merely a printer. He was a man who had been filing land fraud complaints with the Ohio State Legislature since 1831, with the steady and slightly exhausted commitment of someone who had made a decision about what his newspaper was for. He had published 11 articles on channel manipulation and interstate boundary disputes in the previous 3 years, each one carefully documented, each one politely ignored by the relevant state agencies, and each one kept on file in the Gazette's archive in a growing stack of paper that represented the difference between being right and being heard. What Silas Keel put on his table on the night of June 18th, 1834, was something different from everything he had previously received. He had a 19-year continuous measurement record from a single fixed location on the Ohio River, with observations covering every open water month from 1815 through 1833. He had a civil engineer's field notebook containing the design specifications, construction phases, and financing notes for the specific fraudulent structure that had altered the measurements. He had a dead man's final refusal to participate in the fraud, written in the man's own hand on the last page of that same notebook, and he had a copy of a county-filed Army survey showing numbers that were directly incompatible with the 19-year record, incompatible in a specific, directional, legally meaningful way that could only be explained by one of two conclusions. Either Silas Keel had been systematically wrong about the same river for 19 years, or Army Lieutenant Josiah Briggs had surveyed a fraudulently altered river and certified the result as natural. Olmsted read everything twice. He took 17 pages of handwritten notes. At 2 a.m, he leaned back from the table and said, "The Kanawha River Associates. I know that name. I have a filing from 1832 in my archive. A Virginia attorney registering their land warrant holdings in 3 Ohio counties. I thought it was routine at the time." He went to his files. He returned with a document that listed the 4 principals of the Kanawha River Associates by full name, alongside their holdings and attorneys of record. The 4th name was not Vic, Marsh, or any of the initials from Holt's notebook. It was Briggs. Lieutenant Josiah A. Briggs, United States Army Corps of Engineers, listed as a silent partner with a 20% holding stake, his name appearing under a provision that allowed active military personnel to hold private land interests through a family trust. He had not merely been bribed to certify a fraudulent survey. He had been a financial partner in the fraud from the beginning, certifying a river condition that would directly increase the value of land he personally owned a stake in. The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, Columbus moved in whatever small ways a capital city moves at 2 a.m. Olmsted said, "We go to the legislature in the morning." The Ohio State Senate Committee on Lands and Navigation convened a special session on June 23, 1834, at the request of Senator Emmett Flagg of Athens County, who had been contacted by Olmsted 2 days earlier, and who had read the Gazette's preliminary summary in 4 hours and driven his horse into Columbus overnight. The session was not public. It was held in a committee room on the 2nd floor of the State House, with 9 senators present, 2 clerks, a stenographer, and a representative from the Attorney General's office, named Pryor, who sat in the back of the room with his arms crossed and said nothing for the first 2 hours. Silas Keel sat at the table in the committee room in clothes that were still damp from 3 days of field walking. He had not shaved. He had slept 6 hours in Olmsted's back office, on a cot that was too short for his frame. He had his canvas sack with him. He put it on the table. A senator named Caldwell from Scioto County was the first to address him. Caldwell was the kind of legislator who wore his skepticism as a professional courtesy. It saved time. He said, "Mr. Keel, we have before us some serious allegations involving federal survey certification, interstate compact law, and what I understand to be a claim that the Ohio River was physically altered by a private company. Before we go any further, I'd like to understand exactly what your measurement system is and whether it would survive the scrutiny of a licensed surveyor." Silas reached into his sack and produced the cut-down willow staff. It was 4 feet of notched wood, wrapped in burlap, worn smooth along the grip from decades of daily handling. He set it on the table in front of Senator Caldwell. He said, "Get me a measuring tape." There was a brief silence. A clerk produced a linen measuring tape from a desk drawer. Silas unwrapped the willow staff and laid it flat beside the tape. He aligned the bottom end. He called out each notch position in sequence, starting from the base. 3 inches, 6 inches, 9 inches, 1 foot, 1 foot 3 inches, continuing up the staff to the 48th notch at 4 feet. A second clerk compared each position against the tape as Silas called it. In 48 measurements, the maximum deviation was 3/16 of an inch. At notch 31, where the wood grain had caused the knife to ride slightly. The room was quiet in the way rooms become quiet when a demonstration has gone differently than expected. Senator Flagg said, "Proceed, Mr. Keel." Silas spent the next 90 minutes presenting his measurements in comparative form. He had prepared a written summary with Olmsted's help the previous evening, a single-page table showing his October 1833 depth readings at each of 12 stone positions, aligned against the corresponding figures from the Briggs Certified Survey of February 14th, 1834. The differences ranged from 19 inches to 31 inches of depth, and the calculated channel thread position diverged by 73 yards between the two documents. He explained the weir structure in the language of a man who had spent 4 hours on the river floor studying it. He explained the displacement of his 12 marker stones. He explained the winter construction window. He explained Holt's field notebook and its implications. Then he put the notebook on the table and opened it to the last page. The stenographer, he noticed, had stopped writing and was simply looking at the page. "I will not certify this. H." The Attorney General's representative Pryor unfolded his arms. Lieutenant Josiah A. Briggs, Army Corps of Engineers, was placed on administrative suspension on July 8, 1834, pending a military board of inquiry. The board convened in Cincinnati on August 14th, reviewed the Keel depth log and Holt's notebook for 3 days, and produced a 31-page internal report that recommended a formal charge of fraudulent certification and conduct unbecoming an officer. The report was submitted to the Army Adjutant General's office in Washington on September 3, 1834. On October 12, 1834, Briggs was granted a medical discharge from the United States Army, citing a respiratory condition of chronic development. The charge report was sealed under administrative review. It remained sealed for 43 years. Briggs moved to western Tennessee and is recorded in 1840 census documents as a land agent. He died in 1852. He never faced a court on the matter of the Ohio River Survey. Harlow Vick dissolved the Carlton's Landing Land Office on August 19, 1834, 4 days after the Ohio Senate Committee issued its preliminary findings. The Kanawha River Associates formally wound down its Virginia filings in September of the same year. The 4 partners scattered across the available geography: Vick to New Orleans, Marsh to Pittsburgh, the other 2 into the inland counties, where men go when cities become inconvenient. No criminal charges were ever filed in Virginia. The Virginia legislature declined to recognize the Ohio Senate Committee's findings as binding on Virginia court proceedings, on the grounds that the committee had no subpoena authority over Virginia residents or Virginia filed documents. The Virginia court case challenging the 31 Ohio homestead claims remained formally active until 1839, when it was quietly dismissed on a procedural technicality by a Virginia judge whose name appears nowhere else in the public record of the period. The Army Corps of Engineers sent a survey team to Keel's Ford in the spring of 1835, 17 months after the weir had been completed. The team confirmed the structure, 2 rows of driven timber stakes at a bearing of 28 degrees to current flow, with flat limestone fill between them, running for a distance of 63 feet along the riverbed at a point 71 feet from the Virginia bank. The structure was dynamited in 3 charges on May 19, 1835. The Army's filed report on the demolition described the structure as a probable private mill obstruction of undetermined origin. The word weir did not appear in the report. The phrases channel relocation and navigable thread did not appear. The report was filed and indexed under Obstruction Removal, Ohio River, Gallia County, 1835. No reference was made to the Senate Committee investigation, the Briggs Inquiry, the Kanawha River Associates, or the flooding depth records of a ferryman named Silas Keel. The story had lasted 9 months in official view. Then it was placed, piece by piece, into the filing systems of 3 separate institutions: the Ohio State Archives, the Army Adjutant General's Office, and the Gallipolis County Recorder's Office, in a way that ensured no single reader in any one institution would have access to the documents held in the other 2. It was not a conspiracy in the way historians usually use the word. It required no meeting, no document, no formal agreement between parties. It required only the ordinary operation of institutional self-interest, an army that did not wish to be associated with the conduct of one of its engineers, a Virginia political apparatus that had been embarrassed but not defeated, and an Ohio legislature that had done the right thing and then moved on to other business. The ferryman's depth log was filed in the Ohio State Archives on December 12, 1836, cataloged under Navigation Records, Miscellaneous Ferry Operations, Gallia County, Box 14. Holt's notebook went in separately under Deceased Persons Effects, Surrendered Items, 1834 to 1836, Box 7. They sat in separate boxes in the same building for 87 years. Of the 31 farming families whose land titles had been challenged by the Virginia court filing, 19 successfully defended their claims following the Ohio Senate Committee findings, using the committee's preliminary report as supporting documentation in their local court proceedings. 12 families faced continued legal uncertainty through 1836 and 1837. Of those 12, 7 eventually reached negotiated settlements with Virginia-connected landholders at prices below their original purchase values, forced sales in the language of the courts, voluntary agreements in the language of the filings. 5 families, including the Reinhardts of Keel's Ford Bottomland, held their claims intact through the full period of challenge and retained their titles uncontested after the Virginia case's 1839 dismissal. Emmett Reinhardt was 53 years old when the legal challenge finally ended. He was on the same piece of land he had homesteaded in 1820. His 4th child, born in the summer of 1834, while he held the Virginia court papers in both hands in his yard, was a girl he named Clara after her mother. Clara Reinhardt grew up on that land, married, and raised her own children on it. The farm passed through 4 generations. A descendant named Howard Reinhardt sold it in 1961 for $11,000 to a developer building a Riverview housing tract. None of them ever knew about the man in the water at stone position 8, or about the winter nights when the Ohio River was closed to traffic and 12 men worked in the dark below its surface with timber and limestone and the cold conviction of certainty. Or about a ferryman who had walked 120 miles with a 4-foot stick and a canvas sack and sat in an Ohio Senate chamber in wet boots and asked for a measuring tape. Silas Keel returned to Keel's Ford on June 30th, 1834. He reopened the crossing on July 2nd. He ferried 3 passengers that first day and wrote them in his log in his usual hand with the same level of detail he had used for 22 years. Date, time, number of persons, weather condition, water reading at each stone. The 12 stones were still in the positions he had left them. The current was normal for late June. The river floor at stone position 8 read 7 feet and 4 inches. The deep water channel thread had returned southward to approximately its original position after the weir's influence was removed. It was within the limits of seasonal variation, where Silas had always found it. He recorded the measurement in his log and moved to stone 9. He continued to operate Keel's Ford for 7 more years. He made no public statements about the events of 1834. He gave no interviews. He had no interest in any of the forms of attention that the story might, in a different time and with a different man at its center, have generated. He had a river to read and passengers to move, and 12 stones to place each morning in positions that would tell him what the water was doing. He had always understood those things as his particular work in the world, and the events of the summer of 1834 had not changed his understanding of that. He died on February 7th, 1841, of a fever that came in the deep cold of that winter and did not leave. He was 60 years old. He had never married. The ferry operation passed to a nephew from Pennsylvania who ran it for 4 additional years before selling the cable rights to a commercial line in 1845. By 1850, Keel's Ford had been subsumed into a larger commercial crossing operation whose owners had no knowledge of a ferryman's name or a willow staff or 12 stones placed on a river floor before sunrise. The crossing itself disappeared from named navigation documents by 1855. The location continued to be used for small boat traffic. The river continued to move at that point in its own way, indifferent to jurisdiction. In the winter of 1923, a graduate student at Ohio State University named Wendell Pruitt was assigned the unglamorous work of cataloging an uncatalogued section of the state archives. Boxes of mid-19th century county and navigation records that had accumulated in an annex storage room and been formally designated for preservation, without anyone having found the time to examine them. He worked through Box 14 of the Gallia County Navigation Holdings on a Tuesday afternoon in February. He found a 19-year depth log written in a consistent hand on water-damaged ledger paper, accompanied by a 4-page explanatory note in the same hand, dated July 1836, describing the events of the summer of 1834 in plain, unembellished language. He cataloged it and moved on. 3 weeks later, working through Box 7 of the Deceased Persons Effects Holdings, he found a leather notebook with a brass clasp, 17 pages legible, bearing the heading Kanawha River Associates, Channel Relocation Survey, and ending with a single sentence in a larger hand. I will not certify this. H. He held the two documents together for a full morning. He cross-referenced them against the Gallia County Recorder's file index and found the Briggs survey filing of March 3, 1834. He searched the Ohio Senate Committee records and found the sealed transcript of the June 23rd session. He found Olmsted's 1834 Gazette articles. He found the Army demolition report and its description of a probable private mill obstruction. In 1924, Wendell Pruitt published a 14-page article in the Ohio Archaeological and Historical Quarterly titled The Keel's Ford Channel Diversion of 1833 to 34, a case study in interstate boundary fraud and documentary suppression. It was the most complete account of the affair ever assembled. It was read by approximately 60 people in the year of its publication and cited in a footnote in a 1967 river history monograph used in exactly 3 university courses. The story of the 12 river stones and the man who noticed they had moved was not, properly speaking, unknown after 1924. It was available. It sat in a quarterly journal in university libraries in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, findable by anyone who was looking for it. Almost no one was looking for it. The willow staff, the cut-down version, 4 feet, 48 notches, was not in the state archive. It had not been filed. It was not mentioned in the Senate committee transcript, which described the measurement demonstration but recorded the instrument only as a notched wooden staff produced by the witness. What happened to it after the June 23rd session ended is not recorded. It may have been taken by Silas Keel when he left Columbus on June 24th. It may have been left in the committee room. It may have been discarded by a clerk who did not know what it was, which is the most likely explanation and the one that requires the least imagination to accept. The Ohio River continued to flow at Keel's Ford in whatever position it chose, indifferent to compact law and legislative committees and everything else the human world placed along its banks. The timber and limestone weir that had redirected it was dynamited in May 1835, and its remnants scattered by the spring current and buried in a decade's accumulation of silt. By the time the Army Corps of Engineers conducted a comprehensive river survey of that stretch in 1881, they found anomalous stone formations at 71 feet from the Virginia bank that their instruments registered as a possible obstruction of uncertain origin, and they noted it and moved on. Nobody in the 1881 survey knew about the notebook in Box 7. Nobody in the 1835 demolition knew about the log in Box 14. Nobody who filed any one of the 3 documents into its institutional resting place had any way of knowing that the others existed. That was not accidental. It was the natural result of a suppression that did not require coordination, because it required only the ordinary tendency of large institutions to categorize things in ways that prevent them from speaking to each other across the distance of a filing cabinet. A ferryman named Silas Keel kept a measurement record for 22 years because a team of horses had nearly drowned in a river he thought he knew. He cut a willow staff from a tree along the Ohio bank and notched it every 3 inches with a jackknife that had been worn smooth by the time of the first notch and was worn smooth still at the last. He placed 12 stones on a river floor before sunrise on the first of every open month and measured what the water was doing and wrote it down in a ledger book that no one asked to see. In the spring of 1834, the stones moved. He noticed. he went into the water and found what was there. That is finally the whole of it. A man who paid attention for 19 years to something no one thought mattered and who noticed, 4 months after the crime was legally complete, and 89 years before anyone connected the documents, that the river he crossed every day was not the river it had been. The willow staff is gone. The 12 stones are somewhere on the floor of the Ohio River, or scattered across a century and a half of current movement, or incorporated into the accumulated limestone geology of the riverbed in a way that makes them indistinguishable from everything around them. The river does not record what was done to it. Rivers do not have archives. The Ferryman did. The Ohio Archaeological and Historical Quarterly, Volume 33, 1924. Accessed: Ohio State University Library, Columbus. Gallia County Recorder's Archive, Gallipolis, Ohio, Box 7 and Box 14. Ohio Senate Committee on Lands and Navigation, Session Transcript, June 23, 1834. Sealed record accessed, 1923. United States Army Corps of Engineers, Obstruction Removal Report, Gallia County, Ohio River, May 1835. The Columbus Gazette, editions of June 24th through July 12th, 1834. J. Olmsted, editor.